The moment 17-year-old Grace Patterson's ponytail hit the library floor, she knew her life at Riverside High would never be the same. What Bradley Ashworth and his crew didn't realize was that cutting the hair of a scholarship student whose mother worked as a federal prosecutor would trigger a chain reaction that would expose corruption reaching all the way to the school board. They thought they were putting a poor girl in her place. Instead, they had just handed her the keys to dismantling their family dynasties. Stories like this make you wonder how many other students have suffered in silence, watching privilege protect bullies while victims get blamed for fighting back. Grace had arrived at Riverside High School in Millbrook, Connecticut just 6 weeks earlier, carrying nothing but a worn canvas backpack and the weight of her family's financial collapse. Her father's construction business had gone under during the recession, forcing the Pattersons to sell their house in neighboring Fairfield and move into a cramped apartment above her aunt's struggling flower shop. The academic scholarship that brought Grace to Riverside was supposed to be her lifeline, her ticket to maintaining the college prep education she needed for her dream of studying environmental law at Yale. Millbrook was old, Connecticut money personified, tree-lined streets with colonial mansions, country clubs that had waiting lists spanning generations, and a high school that functioned more like a private academy despite being public. The building itself was a testament to generational wealth. Red brick facades with ivy crawling up towards stained glass windows that caught the morning light like jewels. Inside, marble floors echoed with the confident footsteps of students who'd never questioned whether they belonged anywhere. Grace's first day had been a masterclass in subtle social warfare. Her uniform, the required navy blazer, white shirt, and plaid skirt came from the school's gently used program, a euphemism that fooled no one. While her classmates wore designer versions with perfect tailoring, Grace's blazer hung slightly loose at the shoulders, and her skirt was a half-inch longer than the fashionable length. The differences were small enough to comply with dress code, but significant enough to mark her as an outsider. The library had become her refuge, a soaring 2-story space with floor-to-ceiling windows and reading nooks tucked between towering bookshelves. It was where Grace spent her lunch periods and free blocks, not by choice. Exactly. The cafeteria's social geography was as rigidly mapped as the colonial neighborhoods surrounding the school, and there was no table where a scholarship student from the wrong side of town would be welcome. She'd been researching colleges with full-need financial aid. When they found her, Bradley Ashworth entered the library like he owned it, which, technically, his family did. The Ashworth name was carved into the cornerstone of the building, along with half the plaques commemorating major donations over the past century. At Aiteen, Bradley possessed the kind of effortless confidence that came from never having to worry about money. Grades, or consequences, 6 feet tall with perfectly tousled brown hair and the lean build of someone who summered at tennis camps in the Hamptons. He was Riverside's golden boy, captain of the lacrosse team, president of the Honor Society, and holder of a guaranteed legacy admission to Harvard that his great-grandfather's endowment had purchased decades ago. Behind him walked his inner circle, Connor Whitfield, whose father was Millbrook's mayor and whose mother sat on the school board, Tyler Morrison, son of the police chief and star of the swim team, and Madison Clark, whose pharmaceutical heiress mother had funded the school's new science wing. They moved through the library with the casual arrogance of people who'd never been told no in any meaningful way. Grace noticed them approaching her corner table, but didn't look up from her laptop screen. She'd learned that making eye contact was often interpreted as either a challenge or an invitation, both dangerous when you had no social standing to protect you. Well, Bradley's voice carried the kind of prep school accent that turned even casual words into weapons. Look what we found hiding in our library. Grace's fingers stilled on the keyboard, but she kept her eyes fixed on the screen. On it was the application page for a summer environmental internship in Vermont, unpaid, but offering college credit and the kind of experience that might help her compete with the Bradley Ashworths of the world. I said, "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Bradley continued, his voice hardening. "Didn't your parents teach you manners?" "Oh wait, I forgot. They're too busy being poor to teach you anything useful." Connor snickered. "My mom says her dad's the one who screwed up the Thompson renovation last year, left them with water damage that cost $30,000 to fix." This was news to Grace, whose father had mentioned losing a big contract but never the details. Her jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. The library had security cameras. She'd noticed them during her first week. Whatever happened here would be recorded. You know what I think? Madison Clark stepped closer, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I think scholarship students should remember their place. This library was built with donations from families like ours. Students like you should be grateful. We even let you use it. Grace finally looked up, meeting Madison's cold blue eyes with steady brown ones. The library is for all students. It says so right there on the plaque by the door. Ooh. She talks. Tyler mocked, and she thinks she has rights? Bradley leaned down, placing his hands flat on Grace's table. The expensive cologne he wore, something French and aggressively masculine, made her want to recoil, but she held her ground. Let me explain how things work here. Scholarship girl. See, your little charity case status doesn't make you equal to us. It makes you a guest. And guests who don't know their place, well, they stop being welcome. Grace saved her work and slowly closed her laptop. I'm not going anywhere. I have every right to be here. The group exchanged glances, a silent communication honed by years of coordinated social dominance. It was Connor who produced the scissors from his backpack, the kind used in art class with sharp metal blades and bright blue plastic handles. Actually, Connor said, stepping behind Grace's chair, I think you need a makeover. That ponytail is way too long for someone of your status. Grace's blood went cold. Her hair was one of the few things about her appearance she took pride in. Thick, honey blonde waves that fell past her shoulders. Carefully maintained despite her family's financial struggles. More than vanity. It represented something her mother had always told her. They can take away our house, our money, our opportunities, but they can't take away your dignity unless you let them. Don't touch me, Grace said firmly, but her voice carried a tremor she couldn't quite suppress. Relax, Madison said, pulling out her phone. We're just helping you fit in better. Poor girls shouldn't have fancy hair anyway. It's false advertising. The library was nearly empty. Most students were at lunch or in the courtyard enjoying the October sunshine. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian, was at the main desk, with her back turned, helping a teacher locate historical documents. The reading nooks where Grace sat were hidden from the main floor by tall stacks, creating a pocket of privacy that now felt like a trap. Bradley grabbed Grace's shoulder, holding her in place while Connor opened the scissors. The metallic snick of the blades made her heart race. But she forced herself to think strategically. If she screamed, they'd claim it was a prank gone wrong. If she fought back physically, they'd use their size and numbers to overpower her. But if she stayed calm, if she let them think they were winning, please, she said, injecting just enough fear into her voice to sound believable. Please don't do this. Should have thought of that before you forgot your place. Bradley said, Connor, hurry up before someone comes. Connor grabbed Grace's ponytail, pulling her head back sharply. The scissors closed around the gathered hair about 4 inches from her scalp. The sound was sickening, a crunching, tearing noise that seemed to echo in the quiet space between the stacks. Grace bit her lip to keep from crying out as chunks of blonde hair fell to the carpeted floor around her chair. Connor had made the cut deliberately jagged, leaving her with an uneven bob that looked like it had been styled with a weed trimmer. Much better, Madison said, snapping photos with her phone. Now, you look like what you are, trailer trash trying to play dress-up. Grace raised a trembling hand to the back of her head, feeling the ragged edges where her hair used to be. But instead of the devastation they expected to see on her face, she looked up at them with something that made Bradley take an unconscious step backward. She was smiling. Not the broken smile of someone trying to hide their pain, but the satisfied smile of someone who had just been handed exactly what they needed. Thank you, Grace said calmly, reaching into her backpack. This is going to make everything so much easier. Her hand emerged holding not books or supplies, but a small digital recording device, the kind journalism students used for interviews. The red light indicated it had been running the entire time. You recorded us? Tyler's voice cracked slightly. Every word, Grace confirmed, standing and brushing hair off her blazer. The assault, the threats, the admission that you targeted me because of my financial status. Oh, and Madison? Those photos you took constitute evidence of harassment and documentation of a hate crime. Connor still held the scissors, his hand frozen halfway to his side. You can't prove anything. It's just your word against ours. Grace held up her phone, showing the voice memo app that had also been recording. Actually, it's your words against your words, plus the security camera footage, plus the physical evidence. She gestured to the hair scattered around the floor, plus the witness. They turned to see Mrs. Henderson standing at the end of the book stack, her face pale with shock and her own phone in her hand. I've been watching for the past 5 minutes, the librarian said quietly, and recording for the past 3. I was trying to decide whether to intervene or document. You made that decision for me. Bradley's composure finally cracked. You don't understand what you're dealing with. My family built half this town. We can destroy you. Your family built half this town with money made from exploiting workers like my grandfather. Grace replied, her voice steady as steel. And you just gave me everything I need to make sure you never exploit anyone again. She gathered her things with deliberate precision, leaving the scattered hair where it fell. Mrs. Henderson, would you mind calling Principal Morrison? I think he needs to see this recording. Oh, and could you also call the police? I'd like to file assault charges. Madison grabbed Grace's arm as she tried to pass. You little bitch. You planned this. Grace looked down at Madison's perfectly manicured fingers gripping her blazer, then back up at the girl's face. Actually, I didn't. I was just researching colleges and recording notes for my application essay about overcoming adversity. But when you decided to assault me, you turned my homework into evidence. She gently but firmly removed Madison's hand from her arm, and Madison, laying hands on me just now, that's assault number 2. Thank you for making this even easier. As Grace walked toward the library's main desk, she could hear them behind her, frantic whispers about lawyers and cover-ups and calling their parents, but she also heard something else, the sound of Mrs. Henderson's shoes clicking against the marble floor as she headed for the phone to make calls that would change everything. The honey blonde hair scattered on the library carpet caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows, each strand a piece of evidence in what would become the biggest scandal in Riverside High's history. Grace touched the ragged remains of her ponytail one more time, then walked out of the library with her head held high. 3 days later, their names would disappear from the honor roll. But that was just the beginning. The call came at 7:37 that Tuesday morning. 3 days after the library incident, Grace Patterson was standing in her aunt's cramped bathroom, trying to even out the jagged remains of her hair with a pair of nail scissors when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. Miss Patterson, this is Agent Rebecca Torres with the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. I understand you have some recordings that might interest us. Grace's hand stilled on the scissors. I'm sorry. Who is this? Your mother gave us your number. She works with our office on federal prosecution cases. We'd like to meet with you today about the incident at Riverside High. Apparently, what you captured goes much deeper than simple assault. An hour later, Grace sat in a sterile conference room at the FBI field office in Hartford, her mother beside her, and 3 federal agents across the table. The recordings played through high-quality speakers, each word crisp and damning. But it wasn't just her recording they were interested in. Mrs. Henderson, your librarian, contacted us yesterday. Agent Torres explained. She's been documenting incidents at Riverside for over 2 years. Your case was the final piece we needed to move forward. Grace's mother, Patricia Patterson, leaned forward. As a federal prosecutor, she understood the implications immediately. This isn't just about bullying, is it? Agent Torres shook her head. We've been investigating a pattern of civil rights violations and financial irregularities in several Connecticut school districts. Riverside has been of particular interest because of the significant federal funding they receive for their STEM programs. She opened a thick file folder. The Ashworth family, the Clarks, the Whitfields. They're all connected through a network of shell companies that have been funneling federal education grants into personal accounts. They use their positions on school boards and municipal committees to direct contracts to their own businesses. Grace stared at the documents spread across the table. Financial records, email chains, bank statements, evidence of a conspiracy that made her haircutting incident look like a minor prologue to a much larger story. the systematic targeting of scholarship students, the preferential treatment for legacy families, the cover-ups of serious incidents, it's all designed to maintain a specific demographic profile that keeps the federal funding flowing. Agent Torres continued. Schools with higher percentages of low-income students receive more federal money, but if those students are driven out through harassment, the families keep the funding but don't have to actually serve the students. Grace's mother finished. They're literally profiting off of fake diversity statistics. Agent Torres nodded. Your recording proves intent. When Bradley Ashworth said scholarship students should know their place, when Madison Clark admitted they targeted you because of your financial status, that's evidence of a deliberate pattern of discrimination that violates multiple federal statutes. Grace found her voice. How long has this been going on? At least 15 years. Maybe longer. Mrs. Henderson has documentation going back to when she started at Riverside. Students who complained about harassment suddenly had their scholarships revoked for academic performance or behavioral issues. Families who tried to fight back found themselves audited by the IRS. Their businesses investigated. Their reputations destroyed. The pieces were falling into place. Grace remembered the stories her father had told about losing contracts, about clients suddenly backing out of deals, about a business that had thrived for 20 years collapsing in 6 months. She'd thought it was just the economy. Now she realized it might have been retaliation. What happens now? Grace asked. Agent Torres smiled grimly. Now we take down an entire criminal enterprise. And you, Miss Patterson, are going to help us do it. The next morning, Grace walked into Riverside High with a wire taped to her chest and a federal agent parked across the street. The news of the library incident had spread through the school like wildfire. But the official story was that it was being handled internally. Principal Morrison had made an announcement about inappropriate behavior and counseling resources, but Bradley and his crew were still in classes, still sitting at their usual table in the cafeteria, still acting like they owned the world. Grace had insisted on returning to school despite her mother's concerns. The FBI needed more evidence, more recordings, more proof of the systematic nature of the harassment, and Grace had her own reasons for wanting to face them again. She'd spent the weekend practicing responses with Agent Torres, learning how to steer conversations toward admissions, how to stay calm under pressure, how to think like an investigator instead of a victim. The jagged bob that had been meant to humiliate her now felt like armor, visible proof of what they'd done. Impossible to ignore or explain away. The first test came during second period AP history. Bradley sat 3 seats behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence like a storm cloud. When Mrs. Carlyle stepped out to make copies, he leaned forward and whispered in her ear, "You think you won something? Scholarship, girl? My father already talked to the principal. This all goes away by Friday, and you get transferred to public school where you belong." Grace turned slightly, making sure the wire would pick up her response. "Really? Because the FBI agents I talked to yesterday seem to think your father's going to be too busy with federal charges to worry about my transfer." The classroom went dead silent. Students who'd been pretending not to listen suddenly found reasons to turn around. Bradley's face went through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple. "You're lying," he hissed. "My family has connections you can't imagine. We own judges, politicians, police chiefs." "Thank you," Grace said calmly. That's exactly what they wanted to hear. It took Bradley a moment to realize what she'd said. When understanding dawned, his face went completely white. "You're wearing a wire," he breathed. Grace smiled and turned back to her textbook. "Prove it." The rest of the day was a masterclass in watching privilege unravel in real time. Word spread that Grace was cooperating with federal investigators, and suddenly every student who'd ever been harassed, humiliated, or driven out of Riverside found their voice. They approached her in hallways, slipped notes into her locker, sent encrypted messages through apps the school couldn't monitor. The stories were devastating. Jennifer Martinez, whose family had been forced to move to another district after her father's landscaping business mysteriously lost all its municipal contracts following her complaint about sexual harassment. David Kim, who'd been expelled for academic dishonesty after refusing to let Connor Whitfield copy his AP chemistry homework. Sarah Williams, who'd transferred to homeschooling After being relentlessly bullied for her mother's job as a house cleaner, each story followed the same pattern: harassment by the inner circle, complaints to administration, promises of investigation, then sudden retaliation against the family's livelihood until they were forced to leave town or stay silent. Grace documented everything, forwarding information to Agent Torres and building a case that grew stronger by the hour. But she also started something else, a group chat called Riverside Truth that connected current students with former victims, creating a network of witnesses and evidence that stretched back years. The breaking point came on Wednesday afternoon during lunch. Grace was sitting alone in the library. Mrs. Henderson had become her unofficial protector, always nearby when the inner circle was around. When Madison Clark appeared at her table, "You need to stop," Madison said without preamble. "You're going to destroy innocent people." Grace looked up from her essay about systemic inequality in education, a piece she was writing for her college applications that had taken on new urgency. Innocent people like who? Like my mother, like Connor's parents. They donate millions to this school, to this community. They create jobs, fund scholarships, support local businesses, with money they steal from federal education programs. Grace replied, "Money that's supposed to help students like me, not line the pockets of people who already have everything." Madison's composure cracked. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. These families have been part of this community for generations. They built Millbrook. Without them, this whole town would collapse." "Maybe it should," Grace said quietly. "Maybe a town built on corruption and exploitation deserves to collapse, so something better can grow in its place." Madison leaned forward, desperation creeping into her voice. "We can make this go away. Full scholarship to any college you want. Guaranteed admission. Spending money. Whatever you need. Just drop the investigation." Grace felt the wire against her chest, recording every word of attempted bribery. "And what about the next scholarship student? What about the kids who don't have federal prosecutors for mothers? Do they deserve to be harassed and humiliated because their families aren't wealthy enough to buy protection? That's how the world works," Madison snapped, her mask finally falling completely. "The strong survive. The weak get eliminated. Natural selection." "Actually," Grace said, standing and gathering her books, "that's called social Darwinism, and it was used to justify slavery, the Holocaust, and every other system of oppression in human history. Thanks for the confession. Though, the FBI will appreciate your honesty about your worldview." Madison's face went ashen as she realized what she'd just said on record. She grabbed Grace's arm as she tried to leave. "You little bitch. I'll destroy you." "Security camera," Grace said calmly, pointing to the device mounted above the stacks. "Assault number 3. You're really making this easy." That evening, Agent Torres called with an update that changed everything. "We arrested Richard Ashworth an hour ago. Wire fraud, conspiracy, civil rights violations. The works? He's looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison." Grace sat down heavily on her aunt's couch. "What about Bradley?" "Juvenile charges for the assault. But he's 18, so he'll be tried as an adult for the conspiracy charges. Turns out he's been actively involved in the scheme since he was 16, helping falsify enrollment documents, intimidating witnesses, even recruiting other students to target scholarship recipients." The news broke that night on every major Connecticut station. Federal investigation exposes corruption ring at elite high school. The footage showed Richard Ashworth being led away in handcuffs, his perfect hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from the arrest. Local reporters stood outside Riverside High, interviewing shocked parents and community members who claimed they had no idea what was happening. But Grace knew better. She'd seen the way certain families closed ranks, the way complaints disappeared, the way inconvenient students were driven out. This wasn't the work of a few bad actors. It was systematic institutional corruption that required widespread complicity. Thursday morning brought a media circus to Millbrook. News vans lined the streets around Riverside High, reporters interviewing anyone willing to talk about the Millbrook scandal. Grace arrived at school to find clusters of students and parents arguing in the parking lot, some defending the arrested families, others demanding answers about years of covered-up incidents. Principal Morrison had called an emergency assembly, but Grace could see the panic in his eyes. As he took the podium, he'd been complicit too. She was sure of it, and now he was scrambling to save his career and reputation. I want to assure all students and families that Riverside High remains committed to providing an excellent education in a safe environment, he began, his voice shaking slightly. The actions of a few individuals do not reflect the values of our school community. Grace stood up from her seat in the packed auditorium. Principal Morrison, how many scholarship students were forced to leave Riverside in the past 5 years? The auditorium erupted in murmurs. Morrison's face went red as he stammered into the microphone. Miss Patterson, this isn't the appropriate forum for 47, Grace interrupted, reading from her phone. 47 scholarship students left Riverside in the past 5 years. The state average for similar schools is 12. Would you like to explain that statistical anomaly? The crowd was fully engaged now. Parents and students turning to stare at the principal, who clearly hadn't expected to be challenged. Morrison looked desperately toward the exits, where Grace could see 2 men in suits, probably lawyers, gesturing frantically. Furthermore, Grace continued, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, federal records show that Riverside continued to receive funding for those 47 students even after they left. Where did that money go? Morrison abandoned the podium entirely, walking quickly toward the side exit. While chaos erupted in the auditorium, students were shouting questions. Parents were demanding answers. And Grace found herself surrounded by reporters who'd somehow gotten into the building. Miss Patterson, how does it feel to be the whistleblower who brought down this conspiracy? One reporter asked. Shoving a microphone toward her face, Grace looked directly into the camera. This isn't about me. This is about every student who was told they didn't belong, who was harassed until they left, who was silenced by threats and intimidation. This is about making sure it never happens again. By Friday morning, the dominoes were falling fast. Principal Morrison had been placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. Connor Whitfield's father had resigned as mayor amid accusations of using his position to cover up the school scandal. Tyler Morrison's police chief father was under internal investigation for failing to properly investigate assault complaints against the inner circle. And Bradley, Connor, Tyler, and Madison had all been arrested on various charges, ranging from assault to conspiracy to civil rights violations. Grace walked through the halls of Riverside High that Friday morning to find a completely different atmosphere. Students who'd never spoken to her before were nodding respectfully as she passed. Teachers who'd previously treated her as invisible were making eye contact and offering genuine smiles. The subtle social hierarchies that had seemed carved in stone just a week ago were crumbling before her eyes. In the library, her library, she thought of it now. Mrs. Henderson was waiting with a surprise. The reading nook where Grace had been attacked had been transformed into a small memorial display, not to her suffering, but to her courage. Student artwork covered the walls with messages of support and solidarity. Photographs showed the diverse faces of scholarship students past and present, celebrating their achievements and contributions to the school community. The students organized this themselves. Mrs. Henderson explained, tears in her eyes. Once they learned the truth about what had been happening, they wanted to do something positive. Grace touched one of the photos, a girl she recognized from the stories she'd collected, someone who'd been driven out 3 years ago, but had gone on to excel at another school. Has anyone contacted her? The other students who left? That's phase 2, said a voice behind her. Grace turned to find Agent Torres approaching with a smile. We're working with the Department of Education to track down every student who was illegally forced out of programs they were entitled to. Full reinstatement. Financial compensation for damages. Guaranteed placement in programs of their choice. Grace felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying finally lift from her shoulders. What about the families, the ones who lost businesses? Had their lives destroyed for fighting back? Full investigation. Full restitution. Your father's construction company, for instance, we have evidence that Richard Ashworth used his municipal connections to blacklist him from city contracts. That's a federal crime with serious financial penalties. That afternoon, Grace received a text message that made her smile for the first time in weeks. It was from Jennifer Martinez, the girl whose family had been forced to move after her harassment complaint. Saw the news. Thank you for having the courage I couldn't find. My dad's business is thriving in our new town, and I'm valedictorian at my new school. You didn't just save yourself, you saved all of us. Similar messages poured in throughout the weekend. Former Riverside students who'd been scattered across Connecticut and beyond, all of them rebuilding their lives after being driven out by systematic harassment. They shared stories of resilience, of finding strength in new communities, of refusing to let their experiences break them. But the message that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Connor Whitfield, texting from juvenile detention while awaiting trial. I know, sorry doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that what we did was evil. I was raised thinking people like you were less than human, that money and family names made us better. I know now that we were the ones who were less than human. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that you've changed how I see the world. I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends. Grace stared at the message for a long time before responding. The fact that you can recognize what you did was wrong means you can choose to be better. That's all any of us can do. Monday brought news that the corruption investigation had expanded beyond Millbrook. Federal agents were examining similar patterns in elite school districts across Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York. The Riverside model of using harassment to maintain artificial demographics while stealing federal funding appeared to be widespread, protected by networks of wealthy families who moved seamlessly between school boards, municipal governments, and private businesses. Grace found herself at the center of a growing movement. Students from other schools were reaching out, sharing their own stories of systematic discrimination and institutional protection of bullies. Parents were demanding investigations into suspicious patterns of student transfers and scholarship revocations. State legislators were calling for comprehensive education reform. But perhaps the most significant change was happening right at Riverside High. With the inner circle gone and their adult enablers under investigation, the school's social ecosystem was completely reorganizing itself. Students who'd been silent bystanders were finding their voices. Clubs and organizations that had been dominated by legacy families were opening their doors to broader participation. The subtle codes and hierarchies that had maintained inequality were being questioned and dismantled. Grace was elected to the student council by a landslide vote. Despite having been at the school for less than 2 months, her platform was simple: transparency, accountability, and equal treatment regardless of family wealth or background. The first item on her agenda was establishing a peer mediation program to address conflicts before they escalated to harassment, and an anonymous reporting system for discrimination that would be overseen by outside investigators rather than school administration. 3 weeks after the arrests, Grace stood before a packed auditorium at the Connecticut State Capitol, testifying before a legislative committee about education reform. Her jagged bob had grown out enough to style properly, but she chose to keep it short as a reminder of where her journey had started. The systematic harassment of low-income students isn't just about individual cruelty, she told the lawmakers. It's about maintaining artificial scarcity, about preserving systems of privilege that benefit a few at the expense of many. When schools can collect federal funding for students, they drive a way through harassment. They have a financial incentive to discriminate. She held up a folder thick with documentation. The evidence shows this isn't isolated to one school or one district. It's a business model disguised as education, and it's stealing opportunities from the students who need them most. The committee chairman, a gray-haired man who'd initially seemed skeptical of the teenage witness, leaned forward with obvious interest. What specific reforms would you recommend? Miss Patterson? Grace had been preparing for this question for weeks. Mandatory federal oversight for any school district receiving more than 10% of its funding from federal sources. Independent investigation of any student transfer or scholarship revocation. Real-time demographic monitoring to identify suspicious patterns. And most importantly, personal liability for administrators and board members who participate in discrimination schemes. The hearing room buzzed with activity as reporters took notes and photographers captured images of the teenage whistleblower demanding systemic change. Grace could see Agent Torres in the gallery, nodding approvingly as her testimony built the case for federal legislation that would prevent future Riversides. That evening, Grace returned to Millbrook to find the town in the midst of a transformation as dramatic as her own. The old guard families who'd controlled everything for generations were either under investigation, in prison, or had fled to avoid prosecution. New leadership was emerging from unexpected places: Immigrants, working-class families, people who'd been shut out of power for decades. Her father's construction business was not only back on its feet, but thriving, as federal investigators referred victims of the conspiracy to contractors they knew had been unfairly blacklisted. The apartment above her aunt's flower shop no longer felt like a temporary refuge, but like a launching pad for the future Grace was building. But the most meaningful change was personal. Grace had started her junior year as an isolated scholarship student, grateful for scraps and afraid to take up space. She was ending it as a civil rights advocate with a national platform, someone who'd learned that power didn't come from family, wealth, or social position, but from the courage to speak truth, regardless of consequences. The final chapter of the Riverside scandal broke 6 months later when federal prosecutors announced the largest education fraud conviction in Connecticut history. Richard Ashworth was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. Principal Morrison received 15 years. Connor Whitfield, as a juvenile, was sentenced to 3 years in a rehabilitation facility focused on restorative justice, followed by 5 years of community service, working with anti-bullying programs. But the ripple effects of the Riverside case extended far beyond the courtroom. In the weeks leading up to the sentencing, Grace had been contacted by documentary filmmakers, book publishers, and civil rights organizations wanting to tell her story. More importantly, she'd been hearing from students across the country who'd found the courage to speak up about similar situations in their own schools. The Patterson Protocol, named after Grace's methodical approach to documenting harassment and building evidence, had become a template used by student advocates nationwide. Her technique of recording conversations while appearing vulnerable, of gathering allies before confronting power, of building irrefutable evidence before making accusations, was being taught in civil rights workshops and student leadership programs. Grace had initially resisted the attention, preferring to focus on her studies and college preparations. But when she received a letter from a 14-year-old girl in Texas, whose scholarship had been revoked after she reported sexual harassment by a board member's son, Grace realized her responsibility extended beyond Millbrook. "Dear Grace," the letter read, "they're trying to destroy my family the same way they destroyed yours. My mom lost her job. My dad's business is being audited, and they're saying I made up the assault to get attention. I recorded everything like you did, but I'm scared to use it. How did you find the courage to fight back when everyone said you'd lose?" Grace had stared at that letter for hours before calling Agent Torres. Within a week, federal investigators were in Texas, and within a month, another conspiracy was unraveling. The girl's evidence, combined with Grace's guidance on how to present it effectively, had exposed a network of corruption that stretched across 3 school districts. Similar cases began emerging in Georgia, Florida, California, and New York. Each one followed the same pattern: wealthy families using harassment to maintain artificial demographics while stealing federal funding intended for the students they drove away. And in each case, student activists trained in the Patterson Protocol were building the evidence needed to bring down seemingly untouchable power structures. Grace found herself traveling on weekends to speak at conferences and training sessions, teaching other students how to document harassment, how to build cases that would survive legal challenges, how to find their voices in systems designed to silence them. Her jagged haircut had become a symbol of resistance, copied by young activists who wanted to show they wouldn't be intimidated into conformity. The movement grew beyond individual cases of harassment. Students were using Grace's techniques to expose athletic recruitment scandals, to challenge discriminatory disciplinary policies, to fight for equitable distribution of advanced placement courses. They were learning that the same systems that protected bullies also protected other forms of institutional inequality, and that the skills needed to fight one could be applied to fight all of them. Grace was invited to speak at the sentencing hearing, representing the dozens of students whose lives had been damaged by the conspiracy. She stood before the judge and the packed courtroom, looking directly at the defendants as she delivered her statement. "Your Honor, this case isn't really about the money that was stolen, although that matters. It isn't even about the students who were harassed and driven away, although they deserve justice. This case is about the fundamental question of whether we believe all children deserve equal access to education and opportunity, regardless of their family's wealth or status." She paused, looking at Bradley Ashworth, who sat beside his lawyers with tears streaming down his face. The defendants in this case used their privilege to create a system where harassment was not only tolerated but incentivized. They turned education into a business model that profited from discrimination. But their actions also revealed something important. When students find the courage to speak up, when communities demand accountability, when institutions are forced to live up to their stated values, change is possible. Grace had prepared a longer statement, but she found herself deviating from the script as emotions she'd been holding back for months finally surfaced. I want the court to know that I don't hate the people who cut my hair and tried to drive me away. I pity them. They were so afraid of competition, so terrified of sharing space with people they considered beneath them, that they turned to criminal conspiracy to maintain their advantages. That's not strength, that's the weakest, most cowardly response imaginable. She turned to address Bradley directly, but I also want you to know that your actions set in motion changes you never intended. Students across the country are finding their voices. Communities are demanding transparency. And young people who might have suffered in silence are learning that they have power, that their stories matter, that justice is possible, even when it seems impossible. The judge's final statement before sentencing reflected the broader significance of the case. The defendants exploited their positions of trust to create a culture of fear and intimidation that violated the civil rights of vulnerable students. Their actions represent not just individual crimes, but an assault on the fundamental principle of equal educational opportunity that forms the foundation of American democracy. 1 year later, Grace Patterson walked across the stage at her high school graduation as valedictorian of Riverside High's transformed senior class. Her acceptance speech focused not on her own achievements, but on the collective work of rebuilding an institution around values of equity and inclusion, rather than privilege and exclusion. In the audience, her parents beamed with pride that her father's construction business now successful enough that they'd been able to buy their own house in Millbrook. Federal restitution payments had helped, but more importantly, the criminal conspiracy that had blacklisted him was gone, replaced by transparent bidding processes that rewarded merit over connections. Agent Torres was also in the audience. Having become something of a mentor to Grace over the past year, the Riverside investigation had led to similar prosecutions in 17 other school districts, resulting in federal legislation requiring independent oversight of any school receiving federal funding. Torres often said that Grace's courage to speak up had prevented countless other students from suffering similar harassment. But perhaps the most meaningful presence in the audience was Mrs. Henderson. To the librarian who'd chosen to document rather than look away when Grace was attacked, she'd become the head of a new student advocacy program at Riverside, working to ensure that every student felt safe, valued, and heard. As Grace concluded her speech, she looked out at the transformed community around her. The old hierarchies based on family wealth and legacy status had been replaced by something more dynamic and inclusive. Students from all backgrounds now participated in leadership roles. The school's diversity wasn't just demographic but intellectual and creative, with scholarship students like Grace setting new standards for academic and civic excellence. Change is never easy. Grace told her graduating class, "It requires courage to challenge systems that seem permanent, wisdom to envision something better, and persistence to see transformation through to completion. But the alternative, accepting injustice, remaining silent in the face of cruelty, allowing fear to dictate our choices, that's not really living at all." She paused, unconsciously touching her hair, which had grown back thicker and healthier than before. A year ago, someone tried to cut me down to size. They thought they could humiliate me into silence, force me to accept a place they'd chosen for me. Instead, they gave me evidence of systematic corruption and the motivation to fight back. Sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest opportunities. Not because suffering is good, but because facing injustice can reveal strength we didn't know we had. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, but Grace's mind was already turning toward the future. She'd been accepted to Yale with a full scholarship, planning to study both law and public policy. Her goal was to continue the work she'd started at Riverside on a national scale, fighting for educational equity and civil rights. As she left the stage, diploma in hand, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she'd been a terrified scholarship student trying to make herself invisible. Today, she was a nationally recognized advocate for educational justice with a clear sense of purpose and the skills to achieve it. The bullies who'd cut her hair thinking they could diminish her had instead set in motion a transformation that reached far beyond their ability to comprehend. Grace Patterson had learned that real power didn't come from cutting others down, it came from lifting everyone up. From refusing to accept that cruelty was inevitable, from believing that even the most entrenched systems could be changed by ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things. And in libraries and classrooms across the country, other students facing their own versions of what Grace had endured were finding the courage to speak up, knowing that someone had proven it was possible to fight back against privilege and power, and win. The scissors that had been meant to mark her as a victim had instead marked the beginning of a movement. Grace Patterson had kept her promise to herself and to every student who'd ever been told they didn't belong. She'd made sure it never happened again.